Shane will introduce our window speaker this morning. Shane.
Well, thanks for being here. I hear there may be a national emergency announcement. I'm glad that you came here instead, because this is, I think, an act of defiant faith and hope to believe there's a bigger thing happening in the world than just whatever urgent thing seems to be in the news today. I want to just do a couple of things because we're trying to not just be people of words and lectures, but of action. And this week, I've got a couple of things to give you. One of them is someone had the great idea of doing Valentines to our politicians around the death penalty. If you didn't know, Saint Valentine, who many Christians around the world celebrate this week, was a victim of execution. He was also kind of a rebel for love. He's a really interesting dude. You could read about. But in light of all that, we've got these Valentines. I know they might be a few days late, but we did some of the hard work, and we put one of the addresses of the governor on there, and you can put other representatives in our state. The state of Pennsylvania still has the death penalty, but we haven't executed anyone in about 20 years, and our governor, Tom Wolf, doesn't want to execute anyone, so he has a moratorium on executions. But when he leaves, this is still a very urgent thing for our state, and many people think that in the next year or so we could abolish the death penalty in the state. So I'll pass this around, and you can write Valentines to Tom Wolf and also to some of our other politicians, okay? So the second thing is this week is also the anniversary of the Parkland shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Florida. We remember that with a heavy heart this morning. And the 105 folks that are dying every day from gun violence. I think I've mentioned it a time or two at these windows that we've just finished a book on gun violence called Beating Guns, and I'll pass these around. We're going to do, my friend who's a blacksmith is bringing the forge to Philadelphia March 8th and 9th, and we will take guns from Philadelphia and melt them into plows. It's free, but you need to reserve a ticket because we think it'll probably fill up. So you can go to our website. Oh, by the way, I got one of them. This is an AR-15 made into a plow. So this is what we're going to make. This was formerly an AR-15 assault rifle like the one that was used in Florida that we turned into a plow. So that's what we'll do, and we'll have some victims' family members share their stories the first week of March, and then we'll take that bus out back, and we're touring around the country in it. So if you know folks in other places, thanks for spreading the word. So that's enough from me. I want to introduce Chris. I met Chris Ha before he was Dr. Chris Ha. He was kind of a scraggly high school student at Willow Creek when I was out there. I spent 1 year in Chicago working at Willow Creek. And just kind of interning for the year, and I met Chris there, and we sparked up a great friendship that might have begun with a little bit of me mentoring him, but now he's been mentoring me. We've been really close friends for 20 years. He is a graduate of Eastern and then went on to start Camden Community Houses, is very much a sister community to the Simple Way that I'm a part of. I also got to be in his wedding. I made the pants in his wedding for all the groomsmen and whatnot, but he's one of my closest buddies. I also think, stepping back from my personal friendship with Chris, he's one of the most important thinkers in Christianity in the U.S. He's done incredible work. He likes to tell people he helped me write my best book, Jesus for President. We wrote together, and we've got some of them back there. But his book, we have some copies of, Willow Creek to Sacred Heart, an incredible book that you can also get afterwards back in the back. This morning, he's also teaching now at the University of Scranton. The talk he'll be giving us this morning is Why Love the Awful? On Catholicism, Camden, and Crisis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Ha. Thanks, buddy.
Well, Thank you all so much for coming this morning. It is such a pleasure to be here. And just walking around the campus and seeing the trees, I miss it dearly here, and it is salve on the soul just to even be on campus. So thank you. I often speak extemporaneously and shoot from the hip, but I actually have prepared some remarks because I want to very carefully share what I wanted to say with you. So if you don't mind, I will be reading my talk, but I've also left some time at the end for some Q&A if we can. So maybe I could start at the beginning of my story here, which is that I was born into a family with Catholic roots, living a fairly normal and content life in the suburbs of Chicago. And by my teens, our family, having grown weary of the rote liturgy of Catholicism, we found modern evangelicalism much more appealing. For us, that was at the enormous megachurch called Willow Creek Community Church that Shane mentioned. Its bright and spunky teaching on an enormous stage with jumbotrons, guitars, and fog machines to boot all seemed more honest and relevant than the stuffy ritualism of the Catholic Church. They claim to have given up on the historic squabbles of the church by proclaiming themselves just followers of Jesus and non-denominational. I had only attended Willow for about a year when, in high school, I was to grow up a little too quickly. I had a friend, only 15 years old, who committed suicide in a manner imitative of Kurt Cobain. This pushed me into a spiritual journey of working through grief in our hurting world. I was thus very lucky to have been assigned at that time 2 young mentors and small group leaders at Willow, one of whom Shane was. Instead of the usual youth group fluff, they regularly brought me down to the streets of Chicago, forcing me to face my own suburban isolation from the poor, and just to talk with homeless folks, sometimes bringing along food or sleeping bags. And so part of my process in dealing with the suicide involved not just going inward, but going outward to connect with the pain of those living on the streets. In this, I might have been challenged a little bit more than the average youth grouper, but still, as a guitarist in a punk band in high school, I also found it plenty fun to join in leading worship in Willow's grand theater. Amidst both the challenge and the fun, I am so thankful to that community for imbuing in me a conviction that Christians should be 100% devoted followers of Christ, as they say at Willow, and even 90% falls short. But I would eventually come to find that this evangelical devotion with hands lifted in sincere, eye-squinting praise can often, in fact, be part of a shining religious facade, a tomb under which the bones of our society's destruction are hidden. I came here to college at Eastern, and as I said, I loved it dearly being here. Besides studying ravenously, every week I joined the yacht club in hitting Philly's streets with sandwiches to talk with the homeless, and it was in my junior year here that I experienced the September 11th attacks. In the aftermath, our Christian nation beat the war drums very loudly, leading to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Sensing that much of our society didn't seem to notice that our bombings were hitting tons of civilians and homes, I slept out in front of Goff Hall for a month with a reminder next to me, a simple cardboard sign that read, "Our bombs are making thousands homeless abroad," to the curiosity of those who had to walk around me. I also remember leading worship on Sunday nights here over in the cafeteria, reading the prophets between the songs in their condemning of unjust laws, or reading Wendell Berry, who rebuked our wars as savagely unchristian. And yet, among my fellow evangelicals with whom I worshiped Jesus as Lord, I found either fervent war support or shoulder-shrugging indifference. I had grown up so naive. I had never thought that total devotion to Jesus, while sincere on an individual level, could be co-opted on a national level. I didn't know that evangelicalism had long been marinating in a politics of fear and unquestioning nationalism. While U.S. politicians lied and blundered their way into that war, I also found there was no shortage of Christians willing to justify our government's wreaking vengeance for 9/11 by any means. I recall one pastor telling me, "You shouldn't worry about bombing innocent victims because all people are guilty in the eyes of God." I also began to learn that much of what animates Christian politics is not simply faith, but party loyalty first. One evangelical leader, president of Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Jr., has recently clarified this situation. When asked how his mantras about morality and Christian America relate to his unflappable support for the current executive in the Oval Office, he answered, "I do not look to the teachings of Jesus for what my political beliefs should be." I appreciate that he at last, and at least finally, put his cards on the table. So it was no encouragement to me back in 2003 that the Pope had roundly condemned the idea of invading Iraq as unjust. American Catholics seem to have fallen into the war hypnosis as much as any group. And the child sex abuse scandal of the church at the time only added to the horror and the hypocrisy in the air. So as I finished here at Eastern, I felt no particular religious affiliation, and I was content to leave my religious horizons open and interreligious. So I would attend any denomination of church or read the Tao Te Ching frequently, and even visit Buddhist tea ceremonies. At the cusp of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March 2003, I found myself locking arms with Quakers or pagans, Muslims, Christians, atheists. At the front end of our protest procession, which would block the entrance of Philly's federal building, there was a priest and a Buddhist gravely tolling a weighty bell for the over 500,000 people that would die from what the people of Iraq called our Christian extremism. So, following our civil disobedience, a week in jail gave me time to mourn the dead, consider my complicity, and pray into that feverish silence in our safe distance from the bombings. This was paired with another arrest up at King of Prussia at Lockheed Martin, which is one of the world's largest weapons of mass destruction manufacturers, where I and others, we tried to go do some weapons inspections. You might guess that they failed. So it was around this time that I spent about 5 months living in the Belizean rainforest. I studied there the global ecological crisis and found myself convicted to move into the worst place I could imagine in America and seek ways to help. For I had realized that the world's problems are not only out there or caused by others, but they are created here in our own lifestyles. So the missionary impulse that I had imbibed from my evangelicalism to go abroad and solve Africa's problems was admirable in some sense, but it can also be a prideful expression of imperialism and a failure to see the log in my own eye, that my own country is one of the greatest polluters and sources of conflict in the world. So I began to take seriously Mother Teresa's famous advice, as Shane brought back from Calcutta. There are Calcuttas everywhere in the world. Go find your own Calcutta. So my Calcutta turned out to be just about a half hour east of here in Camden, New Jersey. So a Catholic priest from there came to speak on campus here one morning, and we struck up a connection. I went down to visit him, and I found his neighborhood exactly as he described. It involved streets populated by drug dealers, lingering alcoholics and prostitutes, abandoned factories galore. The air stank of the only remaining industries, like a massive sewage treatment plant, and diesel trucks carrying scrap metal around. More than half of the kids by the age of five had asthma, and some blocks were eerily abandoned, others with just one house occupied, surrounded by a Rust Belt apocalypse. So I asked the priest if they needed some help and if there were any abandoned houses that I could move into. And I handed him a little manifesto I wrote up of a community that I wanted to start. So with an affirming welcome, this priest walked me across the street to show me through a large abandoned house. We ascended its urine-drenched front steps, upon which sat 4 drunk men. And just like the streets, the inside of the house was littered with garbage, crack bags, needles, porn, feces. Across the street was a liquor store that fueled the street life, and the block's other houses, however, were abandoned, rotting, or knocked down. So I said, looks perfect, I'll take it. So the priest actually cut me a key, and I recruited some like-minded crazy people to join me. Our first night there welcomed us with gunshots right on our front doorstep. This priest, it turns out, had been exiled into Camden by his bishop. He had broken into a federal building to try to burn Vietnam draft cards. And this was grating on the polite manners of the suburban folk. So Father Michael Doyle, in the center there, who's part of this recent documentary, the Camden 28, recounts this dramatic trial in Camden and how he had been exiled there. So anyway, in Camden, with its empty churches and its void of any Catholics, he was supposed to now be quarantined. But the decay of Camden, however, proved not merely an exile. It became the place for him to passionately live the challenge of the gospel with his parish, Sacred Heart, to feed the hungry, to run a school, fight for environmental and political justice in his city, and restore the art and liturgy in his great old neo-Gothic church there. He toiled, he said, under the proverb that even if truth and justice fail us, beauty will save the world. As a foreign Irishman, his homilies were not poisoned with the jingoism we tend to hear from the pulpit on America's high holy days, like July 4th. He slowly read the Gospels as if they were poetically charged with an unimaginable radiation. He said his church should be as welcoming as an Irish pub, and its mass should always lead outward to doing justice. Combined with a beautifully restored painted interior from the 1800s, flush with frescoes and embellishments, there was a mother-daughter pair who were both operatically trained and sang with the bellowing gravitas and pain of Mary in their voice. After Mass, the basement was usually bubbling with coffee, bagels, and new connections, often some street folk, and the basement would also regularly fill up with donated food for sharing with neighbors. All of this facilitated by a parish that often drove in from the burbs to redistribute their time and money. One can easily say that the bishop's exile backfired, and the priest's nefarious influence has been stronger than one could have ever imagined. This is because the gospel is harder to see when the mirages of a manicured world hide our poverty and pain and injustice. The good news takes on a very bold contrast when held up against the backdrop of desperation and the decayed underbelly of society. You haven't quite seen stained glass until you've seen it with bullet holes in it, as happened following this shooting at Sacred Heart you see here. So this very bold vision against the backdrop of Camden's violent poverty and a larger world at war, I experienced in the mysterious symbols of the Mass and Christ crucified something quite profound, as symbolized here in this shrouded crucifix on a Good Friday liturgy. Now, in a different context, I wouldn't blame anyone for dismissing these symbols of the Mass or their rituals as vague obscurities, relics of a medieval haze. But at the time, the images of torture at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq flooded my mind as I entered my first Good Friday liturgy. This liturgy centered, as all masses do, upon a tortured Messiah, crucified by those of whom it was said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." It struck me as the pinnacle of painful, dark mystery that the Eucharistic wafer was called the hostia, which means the victim. What does it mean to gather around a victim at church, to sing hallowed songs and read the sober words of one who was killed by the duplicitous pact between government and lynch mob? Theologian Bill Kavanaugh spoke to this in his book, Torture and Eucharist. Having lived in Chile under Pinochet's dictatorship, Kavanaugh spoke of the church there. For the body of Christ there, practicing the Eucharist meant a counter-performance to state torture and kidnapping. For the Eucharistic victim himself, Jesus, after all, was one of the many whose bodies had disappeared through state violence. Whatever the Mass could mean, it surely struck me as meaning at least the sobriety of having witnessed the torture of an innocent man. Yes, it's much more than this, but it's not less than this. Sacred Heart would practice this sobriety in its final Mass of the liturgical year, bluntly titled the Murder Mass. As a tiny city, Camden's annual murder rate has been upwards of 86 per 100,000, ranking it as one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. There were even a few murders on our block while I lived there. One of my former students, John, and another of a prostitute that my wife Cassie and I often hosted, Shanna. These murders added to the neighborhood's 30-plus murder sites that mark the Stations of the Cross that they hold on Holy Week, visiting each site and reading the Stations of the Cross there. At the murder mass, the names of the murdered were called out along with their ages and their manner of death. Their family or a surrogate would come up to receive their nameplate, hung around their neck, along with lighting a candle. I shudder to include that the list would often include children or infants, killed from blunt trauma, stabbing, or strangling. I was privileged to become friends with a young boy, Jorge, who survived such a shooting, although at the cost of his then 9-year-old eyes. He's here amidst many of the friends gained at Sacred Heart. So the Murder Mass completes the month of remembrance, November, during which pictures of the deceased are placed at the altar to be remembered into the worshiping body. The following week is the first week of the liturgical calendar, during which Sacred Heart blesses expectant mothers. If that contrast isn't startling enough, I recall some weeks or some years when mothers attended both weeks, grieving a killed family member the week before, and the next bringing a tear-drenched baby gestating in her stomach to be blessed. So, this was the very rich, dense life of ritual, communion, and service that was backbone to the community that we started in that neighborhood. The others who joined me in filling this abandoned house included an urban farmer, a teacher, a physical therapist, a carpenter, and many more. We would have common meals almost every day, pray together, we would read the news together and do spiritual reflections together, and go to Mass together at Sacred Heart. When we expanded into multiple houses, we would gather twice a week for meals and meetings to discuss how we were doing. The grating exposure to daily street life in the women receiving catcalls or experiencing brawls and drug dealing, they required this regular support. The daily prostitution solicitations that the women in the community received, even just walking a block to the school, would be discussed over dinner with some dark humor and sometimes sharing advice. One tip for the women was to pretend that you couldn't hear the guy asking you to get in his car, and you would shout really loudly, "I'm sorry, what? Are you paying me to have sex with you? Is that what you want?" This was the urban farmer I mentioned, Andrea Farrick. She's an Eastern alum here as well, graduated 03. She trailblazed an amazing effort with the school to start a greenhouse, student training in urban farming, and an after-school program growing veggies, raising city chickens, and baking with an outdoor bread oven. This Eve's Garden, which was named after a woman who worked the streets, but also joined in the gardening, was and still is a magical place to visit, work in, and sit around a fire amidst an otherwise rusty concrete jungle. Sacred Heart integrated it into the liturgical cycle with feast day processions through it, along with the gardens growing the flowers to adorn their statue of Mary. So Sacred Heart was performing what felt like a very earthy retrieval of pagan seasonal celebration in its liturgical cycle. Their Lammas Sunday, for example, invokes thanksgiving for the fall harvest, not only with lush wheat abounding throughout its sanctuary, but a post-mass basement chock full of dozens of breads, freshly baked by the parishioners. Or at Pentecost, which coincides with the maturity of spring, the sanctuary becomes loaded with the prunings of oak trees. Or on the Feast of Candlemas, everyone lights a candle, and at the passing of the peace, we each exchange a candle with one another, reflecting our continued sharing of light that none of us own, but we all share with one another. On the feast of the wedding at Cana, wine is passed out to all in the sanctuary and is hoisted in several toasts to God in thanksgiving, that Christ's loving glance at water could actually make it blush. On the feast of Corpus Christi, we would process out to the central neighborhood intersection, the site of an old torn-down house, often full of crack bags and the site of continued beautification by the church, and raise up a high monstrance holding the Eucharist in blessing all four corners of the earth. The Paschal celebration in Holy Week, following the first moon of spring, sanctifies the ancient springtime slaughtering of lambs to place blood upon tent entrances, a tradition long predating the Exodus, signaling hope for the fecundity of flocks. And don't get me started about Easter liturgy, for I can scarcely handle speaking of its depth. So not only the seasonal equinoxes, but even the midpoints between them would be celebrated with joy and solemnity. Father Michael often referred to these cycles as times of attention to the waxing and waning of light, seeing the cosmos as something of an allegory for the divine drama celebrated in the liturgy. His chief aim, he would say, was to invite all to a deep reverence, joyful, deep reverence. And so this paganish way of celebrating God, the cosmos, the seasons, life, and death was quite a contrast with the spiritual but not religious evangelicalism that Willow Creek had taught me. Willow emphasized how Christianity, in one sense, is like an anti-religion. It's anti-ritualistic. Evangelicals critiqued ritualism as legalistic Phariseeism, from which Jesus frees us. The whole idea that God desires mercy but not sacrifice was seen as an attack on sacraments and rituals and priests, all of which are idolatry. But I came to see how the evangelical escape from ritual became a new ritual. Anti-religion becomes a new religion, evoking sincerity and spontaneity, as I often did as a worship leader, with raised hands and closed eyes and smoke machines. That becomes a new planned rote liturgy. Non-denominationalism, I realized, is not an escape from the squabbles of religious history, but it's just the latest Protestant denomination. This is important for us today when the justice-minded gospel can be wrongly thought as an escape from the constraints of tradition and ritual. But the answer to this is not to claim, I just follow Jesus, or to be spiritual but not religious. For the religion of America will soon fill in that space for you with the worship of ourselves, the liturgies of national anthems, the covenant of our manifest American destiny, the priesthood of men in suits, the sacred fear of immigrants, the rituals of war, holy days of the nation state, the human sacrifices of children in cages, the miraculous relics of guns, the sacraments of shopping, and the saints of celebrities. These comprise our unconscious, idolatrous religion. The question is not whether to do ritual, but how to do ritual, how to be religious. Or put differently, we must see that Christianity is both a religion and an anti-religion at the same time. It critiques the falsehoods of our religions without pretending to escape from them by being neutral. As Jesus lived out, he critiqued the tradition of the elders, but he also did not throw them away. He retrieved and refurbished the faith of his ancestors. Jesus' cross and resurrection is a striking example of being both an anti-religion and a religion. The whole idea of a dying and rising God sounds on the surface like yet another pagan deity like Dionysus or Osiris, who were slain and resurrected, as many scholars since the 19th century have noticed. Christianity seems like such paganism, but it is paganism in reverse. As Friedrich Nietzsche and René Girard taught me to see, Christianity may have the outer form and structures of myth and religion, but its animating soul is an anti-myth. For pagan myths said that the mobs who slayed their gods were innocent and their victims were guilty. But in a complete reversal, the resurrected Christ is shown to be totally innocent. He defends the scapegoated. He forgives the mob who knows not what they do, and he exposes the injustice of our world and breathes upon us a courageous love to overcome it. The anti-religion theology that I got from evangelicalism in its opposing Catholic ritualism of the Pharisees, that can become the new Phariseeism. For you see, the Pharisees were actually progressives. They thought that they had escaped the blind ritualism of their ancestors and that they would have never killed the prophets. But Jesus taught that this claim to purity, in fact, proves they would have killed the prophets, for they are now scapegoating their religious ancestors. Catholicism at Sacred Heart showed me how to not antagonize between ritualism and progressivism, between the pagan and the Orthodox. Sacred Heart taught me how to maintain a generous discipleship that bodily celebrates what seems like pagan seasonal cycles, habits, and rituals, but animated with an incessant service to the poor, working for justice, and care for our polluted cities. So you can imagine that just as Sacred Heart was a haven of liturgical craft and artistic restoration, I too underwent my own artistic renaissance there. I made a habit of going into destroyed homes to retrieve old-growth wood from the 1800s before the houses burnt down or were demolished, finding grain and wood that you can't find at any Home Depot. This was for me both an iconic and ecological gesture. It wasn't just green, but it was an iconic gesture in the sense that you can see a glimmer of eschatological hope through damaged, dented, rugged wood when it is reclaimed from the annihilation heap and made new. Reclaimed wood takes on its finish with a far brighter pop and warmer luster than any new growth would. One of my most public projects was to make crosses for each person that was killed that year in Camden, which were then painted by their families and planted before the city hall. I also made some reclaimed wood picture frames there, one of which is titled, "Joseph and Jesus Rebuild the City of Camden," with the painting by the renowned Brother Mickey McGrath. He opened a studio just on the other side of Sacred Heart, and he's there. Here's just a few of our other works that we've done together. Besides his studio, now several other people in the parish, older folks, retired folks, have moved onto the block around the church, making it something of what I would call like a reclaimed parish. So in all, I spent a decade enjoying the beauty as well as the grinding struggles of this neighborhood, its parish life and its work. My work in Camden was both uplifting and something of a purifying purgatory, in the positive sense of that word. But it became more evident in time that I should be regularly teaching, and thus I'm now a professor up at the University of Scranton. As my family has now lived in other Catholic parishes, I have a wife and 2 kids, 8 and 6 years old. Of our experiences at churches, I can easily say that they aren't like Sacred Heart. The word purgatory again comes to mind, but with a stronger emphasis on pain. When I studied in the Catholic Mecca of the University of Notre Dame, I could see how the spirit there was enfeebled by alienation from the poor, who would bless them if they could only escape from the center to the margin. It was not even slightly hard for me to see why people have left the Catholic Church in droves. It is quite simply often more of a corpse than the body of Christ. But I took away a deep lesson both from my life in Camden and my engagement with Catholicism. G.K. Chesterton said that we need in this world not mere pessimism and not mere optimism. When it comes to our cities and our church, we shall not ever dare to say things aren't so bad. We shouldn't merely say they're awful either. Nor should we say they're somewhere in the middle. No, things really are awful. They're probably even worse than you think they are. But Jesus taught us a love that is shrewd as a serpent and innocent as a dove, critical as a prophet, and as ebullient and hopeful as a child. Thus, G.K. wrote about how to love a dreadful district, Pimlico, in his London city, saying, "It's not enough for people to disapprove of Pimlico. In that case, they will just merely cut their throats or move out to the burbs. Nor certainly is it enough for someone to approve of Pimlico, for then it would remain as it is, which would be awful. The only way out of it seems to be for somebody to love Pimlico, to love it with a transcendental tie and without any earthly reason. If there arose someone who loved that city, then it would rise into ivory towers and golden pinnacles. She would attire herself as a woman does when she is loved. If people loved Pimlico as mothers love children, arbitrarily, because it's theirs, in a year or two, it might be fairer than Florence. People did not love Rome because she was great. She was great because they had loved her. So this unconditional love for Pimlico applies not only to my experience of Camden, but also to my being part of the dysfunctional family that Jesus tried to breathe life into, the Church of the Apostles. In the face of the church's historic abuses or its awful cover-ups of priests who abuse kids, I dare not say it's not so bad. I would rather say with Dorothy Day that the church is a whore, but she is my mother. Father Doyle and a whole cloud of devoted parishioners showed me that you reap the church that you sow. For they regularly chose the difficult work of cultivating a rich celebration and practice of faith. And insofar as I now lament my own pathetic church, to that same extent I must ferociously build it up in beauty. For our ailing church, either locally or even globally, becomes lovable insofar as we love it, just as Camden became lovable for the many who chose to love it. So in closing, I invite you to consider how your own faith might be lived, finding your own Calcutta and your own place in our flawed and awful church. For a mature faith must dive into the pain of our world, entering into abandonment as I often felt, going into frightening basements and destroyed streets where the abandonment of God feels complete. But we do so living a poetic paradox, knowing that even God on the cross experienced the abandonment of God. For we inhabit a faith that proclaims triumph over even death itself and awaits and celebrates in joyful hope. That is all. So, my apologies for reading so much of that. I wanted to share it, again, in more concise manner than my usual blabber. I know some of you have to leave soon, but it seems we might have 5 or so minutes for any sort of Q&A or thoughts that you might have about what I shared here, and I would be pleased to hear from you. Yes. Yeah.
I think my question is, I'm wondering how you balance things like, and I don't know that you would even name it this way, but things like guilt or white guilt with the mission of like being called to love people and meet them where they are.
Yeah.
That's also a big question, so I don't expect you to like, but just if you could say something.
Yeah. You know, there is a great civil rights worker named John Perkins. He's an amazing person. And, I mean, in civil rights work, he was beaten within an inch of his life trying to go to the polls. And I learned a lot from John by having a meeting with him once and saying, I'm thinking of moving into Camden, and I am concerned about this combination of both white guilt and also this sort of like the white people moving into the neighborhood to like bring their answers, you know, which is again just like the newest phase of white men imperializing the world. And so I asked all of these sociological questions about how to be careful with that. But Perkins looked at me very carefully and he said, you have to try. He simplified it by saying, you can ask yourself rightly the questions about, you know, being reserved on maybe kind of doing this sort of cross-class, cross-racial work of moving into Camden. But he wanted to emphasize that don't use those questions as a reason not to try. And I took his words with a great sense of challenging me to fail forward, to realize that I don't have all of the answers of what to do, but I'm going to just try, fail at it, and maybe it'll be in the right direction, and always to remain open of different ways to do it. You know, in this case, it's relocation, but there is a million other things that we could do to remove the log in our own eye, so to speak. whether it's the log of our own privilege and our inheritance that we need to start becoming mindful of, or the log that's in our own eye globally, that we're all cumulatively a part of an enormous emergency of a challenge of the global ecological crisis, which is an intergenerational justice issue. And none of us are flagrant sinners in that issue. We're all just needing to figure out how can we be a small part of this larger solution. So anyway, I guess John Perkins, his word there of fail forward, you got to try, I would prefer than any other thoughts so far that I've mentioned. Yes, Phil, and then you.
Your way to your Calcutta went through the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
There are clearly ways to get to your Calcutta that don't need Catholicism.
Sure.
So how essential is Catholicism here? Is it one option among others, or is there something essential about it?
Well, as I try to focus here on today, one of the chief questions was of love, and comparing that to what I experienced in my evangelical world, which is a sense of trying to purify ourselves of the bad church before and to go start a new one. And so that was always the new stage of give up on the old and start anew. And there's something more of a challenge to unconditional love that I was trying to get at in this talk here. Now, in terms of some of the larger questions of Catholicism, I started to come to see it partly through the way Chesterton talks about it, which is I see in the Catholic Church some attempts at binding together many of the truths in Christianity, but not to simply only emphasize one of them. So in the evangelical world that I noticed, Chesterton said, you'll find almost all of the heresies and schisms of the church, they take one mystical idea from the bundle of many ideas in the tradition, and they take that one mystical idea to attack all of the others. So they'll say, like, the Bible, everything's founded on the Bible, and you attack all of the other church furniture, so to speak, with it. And Chesterton said, well, if the church faked its sacraments and faked its rituals, I don't know why they couldn't have faked their scriptures too. So there's something about that trying to just emphasize one piece of the picture, whether it's the Bible or predestination for Calvinism or any of the other singular pieces. I would like to try to prefer to think in terms of the massive bundle and how to not isolate one from them. And at times I see Catholic thought as one of the places that is trying that larger bundle and not just to isolate one of them. But that might be, for another talk in a way. It's a complicated question, and my chief one for today was a sense of deeper, patient, grueling love of awful things, and not just saying, it's not so bad. That's the goal. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the phenomenon of sort of corpse churches, which I think is a little bit more like the problem.
Yeah.
And I think you also talked a lot about like the sort of the necessity to sometimes get out of those to find the living body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on sort of bringing life back into some of these corpses?
Yeah. I guess I would say, like, the story I tried to tell today is an experience of some people doing that in one particular way. It was trying to do it by, in the sense of Camden, embracing the suffering, like not seeing the murders that surround the church as somehow outside of the hope that is discussed in the gospel. But it is part of the story, and that's why they go and do the Stations of the Cross there. Whereas I kind of feel like in our spiritual leprosy that is part of the church is we would be more inclined to avoid or see those things as bad interruptions that we can't talk about or we don't want to see as a part of our faith. But so there are, a million different ways, I suppose, to conceive of how to resuscitate a dead church. But I think what I'm maybe talking about here is in contrast with one of the ways that I heard evangelicals speaking in the late 90s is they would say, find where God is at work and then go join God there. That's fine. I'm open to that. But part of what I'm talking about here is find where you think is the absence of God. Find where you think it's totally annihilated. Go to the dark place. And there you can find the light shining in the darkness.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.